Former Work and Pensions Secretary Iain Duncan Smith is urging Theresa May to reverse cuts to universal credit. Mr. Duncan Smith, who quit days after the 2015 budget, is urging the PM to postpone a plan to raise the income tax threshold to pay for reversing cuts. In 2015, funding cuts to the Universal Credit Work Allowance were announced, reducing the amount people could earn before benefit payments were withdrawn. He argues they cost people up to £1,000 as they moved off benefits into work. Universal Credit's single payment replaces 6 current benefits, including Jobseeker's Allowance, JSA, and Employment and Support Allowance, ESA. Mr. Duncan Smith drove its introduction under the coalition government, although it was beset by delays, IT problems and an entire reset of the system, and was the subject of tensions between the Treasury and the DWP. The Center for Social Justice said reversing the cuts would put money in the pockets of low-paid workers. Now a backbencher, he chairs the Center for Social Justice, which is making the call to reverse the cuts made by former Chancellor George Osborne, who was sacked by Mrs. May when she became Prime Minister in July. The CSJ is pointing to Mrs. May's own words in her first speech as PM, in which she promised those who were just managing that when it comes to taxes, we'll prioritize not the wealthy, but you. Mr. Duncan Smith argued that higher earners would benefit most from raising the income tax threshold, something the government has pledged to do by 2020, and said the money should be spent on those who were just about managing instead. Make sure work always pays. Speaking on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, the former minister said, "One of the key elements as you cross into work, the work allowances, those were all reduced. The problem with that is it means it is more difficult to get people into work and keep them in work. We want to get people into work, we want them to progress through work, but most importantly, we want to make sure work always pays. At the moment is a proposal on the table lifting the tax threshold. Only about 25p in every pound ends up with that group, that bottom 5/10 of the population. With universal credit, £1 or every £1 goes there. It is a more direct way of delivering on Theresa May's statement, which was strong and powerful, to help those who try." The CSJ argues that £3.4 billion cut from the universal credit budget by Mr. Osborne would cost people up to £1,000 as they transitioned from universal credit into work, thereby undermining incentives to take a job and move off benefits. It says the universal credit scheme should be returned to its original design, which it argues would lead to 300,000 more people entering work. Mr. Duncan Smith defended his work at the DWP, following the new film by Ken Loach, Daniel Blake, which tells the story of a joiner in northeast England on benefits. Mr. Loach appeared on BBC's Question Time on Thursday, criticizing the system that tells the most vulnerable people that their poverty is their own fault. Unfair on staff. Mr. Duncan Smith said, "I happen to have a high regard for Mr. Loach as a film director. Whilst on the one level this was a human story, full of pathos and difficulties, I think the film has taken the very worst of anything that can ever happen to anybody and said this is life how it is lived. I don't believe that. Also, his portrayal of job center staff was unfair. Yes, you will always get one of two, but the vast majority are there to work and help people. This idea that everybody is out to crunch you has really hurt a lot of job center staff.